Hello and welcome to the Wilder Lincolnshire podcast from the Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust. I'm Melvyn Prior. With me today, I've got Matt Cox. Hello, Matt.
Good morning, Melvyn, and welcome to the flatlands that we call the Humberhead Levels.
Yeah, flatlands, but we're not talking about the fens. But it could be, couldn't it?
It could be. You could have turned the wrong way as you travelled here this morning. But no, we're in the very northwest of the county, very close to the Yorkshire border, and we're on the eastern end of the Humberhead Peatlands National Nature Reserve. So we're on this very flat landscape. Over to the east we've got the Lincolnshire Wolds, and to the west the Magnesian limestone near Doncaster. But this is the very flat area which would have been the bottom of Lake Humber historically.
Lake Humber?
Lake Humber. So after the last ice age, this area would have been filled with water. We've got lake sediments on the bottom, and then maybe 3,000-4,000 years ago this area would have become very wet, and we start to get the accumulation of peats, which leads to the Humberhead peatlands and where we are today.
So we're on Crowle Moor, but there are other moors that make up this area, aren't there?
We are. So we're on the National Nature Reserve. We're at the eastern end, so this is Crowle Moor, but we're physically connected to Thorn Moor, which is owned and managed by Natural England, and then not physically connected, but part of the whole National Nature Reserve, we also have Hatfield Moor. So the whole unit, the whole National Nature Reserve, is around about 3,000 hectares.
Wow.
Managed for wildlife conservation.
That's incredible. We're not going to go back to the Ice Age, but we'll go back nearly 400 years, because that was part of this history here, wasn't it?
It was. So a very key figure in this area is a chap called Cornelius Vermuyden. As it happens, next year, 2026, is 400 years since Vermuyden entered into an agreement with the then king. And this was an agreement to undertake drainage of Hatfield Chase. He entered into an agreement, and him and his participants got a third of the lands. The king had a third of the lands, and a third was awarded to the local commoners as rights of turbary for digging peat for their home fires.
And is that why he wanted to drain the land to get to the peat?
So it was to improve the area. And another significant activity in this area was also warping. So that's the practice of putting silt onto the land to improve it for farming. So they could access the peats for burning, and they could also put silt onto the land to improve it for farming.
Now, it's interesting because when I think of peat, rightly or wrongly, I think of something that might be in compost that goes onto the garden. But actually, the peat was used for very different purposes, wasn't it?
It was. Sadly today, most people associate peat with the black stuff that you get in a plastic bag from the garden centre. But, well, we're stood on peat at the moment.
It feels quite spongy, doesn't it?
It does, and it's been very dry recently. But peat essentially is only partially decayed organic matter, vegetation, and over time in wet conditions this is a build-up of vegetation. It accumulates, and then we get gradual raising of the land. Where we're stood now, there's probably about 2 or 3 metres of undecayed vegetation under our feet.
Right, okay. But when it was collected, I think it was used for horse bedding and that sort of thing, wasn't it?
It was. That's where the industry for extracting peat began in this area. There were several mills round the edge of the moors from about the 1880s, and they were extracting it to use mainly for animal litter, sending it out to the big cities and using it for bedding for horses and things.
And were they also using it for heat, for fires as well at that point, or did that come later?
That was a little bit earlier, really, when they were cutting
Yeah.
it for domestic burning. It was really when the animal litter took off that they were using it as big industry. And then that died away into the 20th century. But ironically, the advent of the diesel engine then gave them bigger machinery for bigger extractions. The bedding industry died away a little bit, but afterwards we started to get the build-up of the horticultural industry, which is what we know peat for today, sadly.
Now, I know one of the sort of saving graces for the area here, and why we've still got such a lovely area, is the fact that actually the extraction was quite sympathetic, wasn't it? The way they took the peat out.
So on Crowle Moor, we're fairly fortunate that a lot of it was done by very traditional means. We have a strip system really, where peat was block cut in lines, stacked up and dried, and then put onto either carts drawn by horses or narrow gauge railway and taken off. Some of the adjoining moors didn't fare so well. In the late 20th century, they brought in a technique from Holland called strip milling, and that really decimated the landscape. We're fairly fortunate that in some of these wet cuttings that were cut at different periods over time, specialist wildlife has been able to hang on, but some of these big milling fields still remain unvegetated till today.
You were just showing me a great example of the strips where we've got a strip of heather and then there's a strip of what I would just call grass and then another strip of heather. What's that telling us?
You can really see it in the landscape. So parts of the moor, the higher, drier balks will be dominated by heather, and then we'll get the birch scrub coming in. Then the lower parts that have been cut with a drain at the side, you can really see, particularly in the early spring, these white strips of cotton grass. And it only needs to be, a matter of inches for the water to stand, and the vegetation's completely different.
Why do areas of peat matter?
So there's several reasons really. As a conservation charity, our thrust really is the rare and local species. We've got some fantastic species on here. There are plants that are only found here in Lincolnshire. So some of our rarer bog plants like cranberry and bog rosemary.
And I just seen a cranberry, and it would be the same cranberry as we'd have at Christmas.
It looks like a little berry that you could eat, doesn't it?
Yeah. I haven't done.
I think they're quite bitter.
Yeah, I won't then.
And then we've got scarce breeding birds. So this site is designated a special protection area as part of the Thorn and Hatfield Moors site for breeding nightjars. So you may recall it's a nocturnal bird.
Very strange looking bird.
Very strange looking, and it makes a very strange noise. You're more likely to hear them than see them in the spring. But yes, we've somewhere between 10 and 15 males on Crowle annually.
Do they nest on the ground?
They nest on the ground.
Okay.
So yeah, very rare breeding bird, and at times the whole site, the National Nature Reserve, can be about 1% of the population for the country. Yeah. So quite significant.
Have you been out of an evening then and experienced the nightjars flying around and the sound?
It's wonderful. Set times you can really hear them, but you also have to cope with the other wildlife, the midges, which can be quite unpleasant.
Well, you would think of the midges and you would think of that with the wet situation. This year has been incredibly dry. What effect has that had on the moor?
So our management has always been focused on trying to restore a high water table. For the wildlife, a lot of the wet habitats need that water. We talk about the Goldilocks level for a bog, and that's trying to retain the water level somewhere between 10 centimetres below and 10 centimetres above the surface throughout the year. So that's kind of our aim. Doesn't work right across the site because we've got differences in topography, slightly higher areas, slightly lower areas, but that's our aim. From a carbon point of view, that's also really important because wet peat stops it oxidising. As peat starts to dry out, we lose carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and rather than being a carbon store, this site can then become a carbon sink. So degraded peat bogs are a really significant carbon source. People talk about tree planting as being really important, but actually a lot of our bogs that are in a very poor condition are some of our biggest emitters of carbon.
Right, so we need to wet those.
So we need to wet those, put them into good management, and hopefully we can retain carbon well into the future.
Interesting you mentioned trees. We've got birch tree behind us. You've got other birch that's sort of springing up all over the place. And that's the bane of your life, really, isn't it?
It is. So on these peatland sites, birch trees are essentially our nemesis.
Yeah.
The birch comes onto the site following the drainage. It can get a foothold and start to become really established. And as these trees get bigger, they start to suck water like little pumps through evapotranspiration. So by removing birch trees from the surface, we can actually have an impact on water losses from the site. As a wildlife organisation, people don't like to see trees coming down.
No.
It can be a real negative to talk about, but we're looking at the long view, really. We're looking at restoration well into the future, and a birch tree may last 50 or 60 years, and then a lot of the carbon will just be released again. Whereas if we can get this site wet and retain the carbon in the peat body, that's going to be there for thousands of years.
Okay, so we can look at two different aspects there. How do we actually get this moor wetter? What do we need to do? Do we need to trap water somewhere?
So all our water coming into this site comes from rain. It's an entirely rain-fed system. So our priority is to try and stop water leaving the site. So the history of the site is it's been very heavily cut over. There's very few, if any, areas that weren't cut for peat. So we need to identify the drains where water is leaving the site. We will dam those up and try and hold water within the site. We can reduce tree cover to try and stop evapotranspiration and water going up. And then what we can also do is we can try and influence the topography of the site. So we can build things like bunds from peat, which slows the flow of water moving over the surface, which then percolates in and hopefully stays within the system.
Is this the slowing the flow that I hear?
It's a similar idea.
Yeah.
I mean, as I say, all our water comes in from rain.
So it's not really flowing anywhere, but it's coming down. We've got to keep it.
We're trying to keep it within our site.
Yeah. Looking at the site and looking how dry it's been this year, can you see that there's more damage and more of a challenge?
It is a real challenge. I mean, I'm pleased to say that there are some of our wetter areas of site that are still unbelievably wet.
Well, you were squelching in a puddle over here. Well, not a puddle, but in the peat.
I was having a little squelch over there, and I wouldn't consider that one of our wetter areas. But yes, some of our wetter areas have remained wet. It's maybe not as wet as we would like, but we monitor the water levels right across the site, either manually or we've got a system of loggers. So hopefully a bit later in the year that will tell the story of how the water levels have changed this year. But we've also got real challenges like wildfire risk. We were talking earlier that the last few days we have had a little bit of rain, and it's not really been enough to recharge the system, but it has really made me relax in that the wildfire risk has knocked down just that little bit, just to reassure me.
How deep will the peat be in areas that it hasn't been extracted then?
So the area we're standing on, it's probably between 2 and 3 metres.
Okay.
That's reasonably typical on this side of the moors. We do have areas that go down to 4 or 5 metres, and then areas that have been very heavily extracted are stripped almost to mineral. It is said that the deepest peats used to be on thorn moors, which is possibly why that was extracted so intensively.
Yeah.
But on Crowle, we're typically somewhere between 2 and 3 metres. If you think that the accumulation of peat is probably about 1 millimetre a year under the right conditions, so that's between 2,000 and 3,000 years of peat accumulation.
So we can't replace it, can we? We can't do anything to replace the peat.
Not in our lifetime. If we get conditions right, so we get the key mosses, so sphagnums, bog-forming mosses, if we can retain the water levels high, so that Goldilocks level, the sphagnums will gradually rise, the water table will rise, and again, looking at the long view, yes, we could actually see peat creation into the future.
Really interesting.
But it's looking beyond mine and your lifetime.
I know. Sadly, it is, isn't it? It is. Let's talk a bit about some of the species that we might have here, both from flora and fauna as well. So what sort of things are unique to these sort of areas?
So as we've mentioned, we've got things like cranberry and rosemary, which are fairly scarce in Lincolnshire. But if we really drill down into some of the specialist creatures on this site, things like the invertebrates, there's some really rare specialist things on here. I'm not even going to start crawling about looking for some of them, Melvyn.
Was one a beetle you were telling me about earlier?
There's one called the Meyer pill beetle, which is known only from this site in this country.
Nowhere else in this country?
Nowhere else in this country,
Wow.
Only on Thorn and Hatfield moors.
Have you seen one?
I've been shown one.
Oh, okay. So they're not going to suddenly appear.
No, I'm afraid not. It looks like a very small beetle.
Does it?
Surprisingly.
Okay. So again, it's one of those things that a real specialist would have to identify.
But people can appreciate the site with a huge assemblage. It's been said that the insect fauna on this site, well, on the National Nature Reserve as a whole, is round about 5,500 species. So to put that into context, that's probably between a fifth and a quarter of the UK fauna.
Wow. And on our walk here, we've come past moths and butterflies. There was an area that was covered in thistle, but it was just alive with insects, wasn't it?
It was. It's been an absolute wonderful year for butterflies. The one that people associate with this site is a butterfly called the large heath. It's a heathland peatland specialist. A bit more numerous further north, but this is as far south as you will see it on the eastern side of the UK. Associated with the cotton grasses. So again, it's one that's tied to this site.
Right. Well, I'll tell you what we're going to do now. We're going to just move to a slightly different site. And we're going to do a little bit of, is it dipping? What are we doing?
We're going to have a look at one of our dip wells. We'll see if we can do a manual read to see where the water table is and just see how far below the Goldilocks level our water table actually is.
Let's go and do that right now. Well, we've just moved to a slightly different location on Crowle Moor. We've come across to the dip well. So, Matt, just explain what we're doing here and why you're doing it.
So this is one of our network of dip wells across the site. It sounds far more extravagant than it is. But essentially what we're doing, Melvyn, is we're going to look at how far below the surface the water table is. We spoke earlier about the Goldilocks level of trying to keep a high water table for our wetland peatland communities. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to drop this very simple probe into the ground here and we'll see how far below the surface the water table is. This is a very primitive manual system, but across some of the site we do have automated loggers, so they're taking readings every hour right through the year. And as I said, later in the year we'll be able to plot that up and see what the water table's done throughout the year.
Now, it looks like you've got a giant tape measure here with like a sensor on the end.
That's more or less what it is. So
okay.
It is a giant tape reel with a probe on the end, and hopefully if the battery's not flat on this one, we'll get a little light and it'll make a bit of a beep as it hits the water surface.
Okay, so what we've got here, we've got a plastic pipe that's been sort of drilled into the ground, if you like. So that's going to go down there. Hopefully, when it gets to the water level, we'll hear a signal, will we?
So this is a slotted plastic pipe,
yeah,
so that the water can move between the pipe and the surrounding area.
Right.
So hopefully the water table in that pipe is indicative of what you're standing on.
Okay,
So
shall we give it a go?
As we drop this probe down,
go on then, let's have a go.
Some water in it.
Okay, let's have a go.
The jeopardy.
Ooh,
There we go.
is that a good sign?
So we have some water and we've not rolled too much tape out.
Okay, right, that's the point. So that's showing 64 centimetres, 63, 64 centimetres, but we've got to take off the height of the pipe, haven't we?
Yep, so that's 64 from the top of the pipe, but our dip well pipe is a little bit above the surface. So if we just estimate there, that measures, so we've 43.
Yeah.
So around about 20 centimetres below surface.
Is that good?
That's, given the year that we've had, I'm fairly pleased with that.
Right.
We've only had a couple of days of rain to recharge recently, not a huge amount of rain. So we're not too far off surface there.
And what about the fluctuation then across the year? In the winter, if we came and did this, would it be much higher?
We'd probably be looking above the surface where we stood.
Or would they be wellies?
This particular dip well, it's not on a wet area of the site, but we are in one of the peat cuttings. You can see behind me we've got the heathers on the drier area. We're in a slightly lower point here. So we are in a wetter area of this part of the site, but this part of the site is not a wet part, if that makes sense.
This is quite a wild area when you look across here, isn't it? What do you love about working on a site like this?
It's probably as near as what you could get to a wilderness environment, really. I like to say to people in this area. I mean, you can just about see behind me that there's some wind turbines.
Oh, yes, yeah.
So
just over the top of the trees there, yeah.
The influence of man can be seen on the horizon. But no, man's been present in this environment for years and years. We've cut peat, we've warped, we've done all sorts. It feels like a wilderness, but the hand of man can really be seen all around us if we look at it in detail.
Indeed. And as we've already touched on, the carbon element of things, peat plays a huge part in that, doesn't it?
It does. It's a hugely important site in terms of its wildlife, but also from a carbon capture perspective. And as we touched on, it is a really long-term thing. We're managing this site for wildlife now, but in terms of a climate perspective, we're looking many, many years into the future.